among one of the earlier investigators looking at periodontal disease and diabetes first. And we had a very large study, which I think was convincing to us and to the field that there was a connection, and that is that diabetes was a risk factor for periodontal disease. That is, if you have diabetes, you have more chance of having periodontal disease and more severe disease, especially if your diabetes is not controlled. Then we also were among the first to show that there's a reciprocal relationship. It's a two-way street. That is, if you have diabetes and also have periodontal disease, you're at greater risk of dying from heart disease and from kidney disease. And also your blood sugar control is not as good as if you did not have periodontal disease. So it seems that periodontal disease increases the risk for having poor sugar control and the consequences of that, like heart disease and kidney disease. So we think that that this is a very strong connection, and in fact, Sunstar has supported over 20 conferences where we have talked to diabetologists, nutritionists, diabetes nurses, dentists, and hygienists about this connection and help them to think about it and maybe to encourage interdisciplinary between profession collaboration in the management of patients with diabetes, most of whom have periodontal disease. The oral microbiome is a new term for the total genetic component of the oral flora, the microbiota, the bacteria in the oral cavity. It's well known that the bacteria in the oral cavity attach to the tooth at the gum line, and they grow down below the gum and they trigger periodontal disease. And without them, there would be little or no periodontal disease. So how do they do that? Well, the bacteria themselves, the oral microbiome at the gingival margin, has toxic factors. And these toxic factors actually can damage cells. They also have factors like antigens and lipopolysaccharide, a cell wall constituent, that trigger the host, trigger the body, to make substances that cause inflammation, and that those inflammatory substances in turn cause tissue damage. They cause the ligament that attaches the tooth to the bone to be destroyed, and they cause the bone to be destroyed, and eventually the tooth is lost if it's not treated. So the oral microbiome plays a key role in triggering the host response, which is an exaggerated response leading to bone destruction, ligament destruction, gum destruction, and tooth loss. Periodontal disease is basically an infection, so you should be able to look at the organisms that are there, which are causative or which trigger adverse host responses, and diagnose the disease. However, it turns out that periodontal disease is not an infection by one or two or three organisms. It's a polymicrobial. It's many, many organisms as a biofilm, as a community that cause periodontal disease. So this community varies from site to site in anybody's mouth and varies between patients. So it's been very difficult to find a group of organisms that are commonly found with active periodontal disease in most patients. However, we have a new science called the evaluation of the microbiome, which should give us some idea of some constant factors which lead to the cause of periodontal disease. And these are the functions of the organism. So without getting too complicated, you could have various clusters of organisms that are different organisms in these clusters, but they have the same functions. So I think the future is to look at those functions. And the functions may be chemotaxis, bringing neutrophils out of the bloodstream into the tissue where they cause destruction. The functions can be lipopolysaccharide synthesis. That's a toxin that the bacteria make. And all of the bacteria that are responsible for periodontal disease, many of them share that function to make this lipopolysaccharide. And there are several other common functions. And so I think that we should be able to look at these common functions which will differentiate disease from health. And they may be factors that are in the saliva or the blood. And so if they're in the saliva, that would make the diagnosis quite easy, because it's very easy to collect a saliva sample. Could even be used as a home test for the patient to monitor their periodontal status. So that's the hope, that we look at these common functions. Yes, I think the Perio Link Award, this was the first time that it was done. I think the experience was excellent. As you know, the first place got over 2,000 votes. And as I mentioned, there are probably 1,000 periodontal researchers worldwide. So 2,000 votes represents a large, percent of the, maybe all the periodontal researchers voting, but maybe many others. So I think the process of getting the votes seemed to be successful. Only time will tell. But the process seemed to work, and I thought it certainly, the paper that was selected was an outstanding paper in periodontal disease mechanism, and that mechanism involves inflammation, and inflammation is central to the issue of why periodontal disease affects so many other diseases. The connecting link mechanistically is inflammation. Periodontal inflammation spills over into the blood, causing systemic inflammation, which leads to heart disease, leads to poor control of sugar and diabetes, for example. So the paper selected gets to a mechanism of how these, how the periodontal disease is linked to systemic disease. So the selected paper, by the process, which I think was fair, was an appropriate one.